Hey, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 7 game from the Reykjavik Open. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I won a very, very long grind against the young Danish talent Mikkel Mensur Jakobsen. And after that win, it really put me in a pretty good position because through 6 rounds, I'd only lost 1 game, and so I knew I'd be playing a very, very strong GM in this one. It turns out that my opponent was none other than the young Dutch talent Jorden van Foreest, who has really been one of the talented juniors in Europe for quite a few years now, and has, I believe, trained under the Dutch Grandmaster Sergei Tiviakov, who's very, very good. So has a very nice classical education with chess and also just a very, very strong and dangerous opponent. I believe he'd actually crossed 2600 and been as high as like 2630 or 2640, but at the time of this game, Jorden was just under 2600 FIDE, so I don't know if he'd maybe had a few bad results right before, but in any case, with young players, they're getting better all the time, so you really can't even look at their rating to judge where they are, and this guy's a super strong GM, so I was looking forward to the challenge. Now, Jorden was white and I was black, so let's get into it. So he opened with e4. I actually expected this because he'd actually played e4 quite a bit and I'd looked at his games. And I played e5, which I was hoping would surprise him because I hadn't played e5 very much at all over the course of 2019. And yeah, of course, this is kind of standard fare. Nothing is original on move 1, but just hoping to be the first one to surprise. He went knight f3. I went knight c6, and he went bishop c4. And here, bishop c4 was a little bit of a surprise to me because usually when you expect at this level to be facing a lot of Ruy Lopez type of systems, so I expected bishop b5. But bishop c4 is actually, the second most popular move, and at the moment, the Italian game is extremely trendy. So I had looked at this as well, and I opted to play bishop c5, which I believe is a little bit of a safer response than the sharp knight f6, which invites these fried liver lines, which are just total madness in these types of positions. The idea here is that, white, gets a pawn, but black has a, and white spoils black's pawn structure, but black maybe has a slight lead in development and, uses their activity to offset the deficiency on the queen side. I didn't want to go for this because it's a little bit too unbalanced for my taste. So I went for bishop c5, which is a little bit more of a little safer approach in my opinion. White now went c3, which is normal in the Italian game. And I went knight f6. And in this position, I was actually expecting d3, which is normally what you get a lot is these kind of slow type of positions with d3 and d6 and castles and even a6 at times, preparing to drop the bishop back on a7. And these types of lines like knight bd2, bishop a7, they've been going on for quite some time. At the top level, it seems like the Italian game is played every few white games because you just kind of get a position and you try to squeeze black. And I think one of the main concepts in the Italian that's important to note is this knight on c6. They argue that it's a little bit misplaced because the c3 pawn is dominating its squares in the middle. So this happened many times before, and this is kind of a position I didn't mind playing. But Jorden had other intentions and went for d4, which came as a huge shock to me. Not because it's like just a move you can't play. It is a move you can play, but it just is not really played that much at the 2600 and up level. A lot of the GMs go for classical openings, not sort of openings from the 20th century or the 19th century. But anyways, after e takes d4, e5 was played, and this was the second surprise, or the third surprise for me, is because normally you see c takes d4. And the line here is actually bishop b4 check, bishop d2, and black actually has 2 choices here. There's bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, and d5, breaking up white's pawn chain. This happens quite a bit, actually. But there's also, after bishop d2, I think you can actually play knight takes e4 as well. And there's some lines of like bishop takes, knight takes, check, king takes, and I believe this type of stuff has also been played many times before. So there are many different lines here, and they all tend to veer towards equality, but I think the thing that white is looking for is trying to find something that's fresh and new. And little did I know at the time of this game that actually e5 was quite trendy. The point is that after d5, and now white goes bishop b5 and just pins the knight, and you get a kind of original position after knight e4, which was played, c takes d4, bishop b6, knight c3. White gets an unbalanced position where essentially he has one extra pawn on the king side. I have one extra pawn on the queen side, but the extra pawn on the king side could kind of facilitate some attack after white castles, and my knight on e4 might not be so secure for the rest of the game. So it's a really tricky and dynamic position that I just wasn't familiar with. And I have to be honest, actually starting at e5 in this position, I actually had to think every single move, which is kind of embarrassing because you might think, oh, well, aren't these moves obvious? Well, d5 was kind of obvious to me. I'd seen that. But after bishop b5, knight e4, and c takes d4, I actually had to think for a moment whether bishop b4 check or bishop b6 was the better move, which was a total waste of time. I mean, I guess it wasn't because I landed on the right move, but I actually thought about playing bishop b4 check, and that'd be a serious mistake because it would mean that my bishop is just like totally misplaced here, and it's not actually eyeing the d4 pawn, which is important. After bishop b4 check, white could play, I believe, a move like knight bd2, and my bishop on b4 is just totally misplaced. And if I trade everything on d2 and we get a position like this, white has this dream scenario where, my knight on c6 is pretty bad, and white can even consider ruining my pawn structure with bishop takes c6, and there are just too many advantages to name in this position for white. So I think, I spent some time on some pretty bad lines. But anyways, I found my footing and went bishop b6. So here, knight c3, like I said, and I was thinking about already how my knight on e4 would be secure, because I could see a future where if it's attacked again, it wouldn't be secure. So I was thinking, what do I need to play f5? Do I need to play bishop f5? Should I take on c3? We'll come back to this in a moment. I castled first, and now white went bishop e3, which is a reasonable move, adding reinforcement to the d4 pawn. And now I made a mistake that was basically hinged on some of my thoughts before about this e4 knight. I was very wary of scenarios where, the queen might attack this knight again, or the bishop might attack it. And I was like, well, I don't really want to exchange on c3, because if I exchange on c3, after b takes c3, this pawn structure is really strengthened. So if we have this scenario, this bishop looks like a very bad piece, and this knight looks like a very bad piece. So I thought that taking on c3 wasn't good, and I was like, I don't know, I don't like that. The other thing I didn't like is if I go f5 to reinforce, which is actually a move, I didn't like that there was lines with e takes f6. And I thought that after rook takes f6, it's very double-edged because I've weakened this diagonal. I've weakened my king a little bit. And in return, I get the f-file, sure, for my rook and some activity. But it seems like a very sharp position where if you haven't, done computer analysis, it doesn't make sense to go for it. And I was certainly unfamiliar with the position, so I thought it'd be wise to go for something that was a little less sharp. So because of that, I wound up landing on bishop f5. And bishop f5 is a mistake. Part of the reason that bishop f5 is a mistake is because it's not particularly secure on this diagonal, and we'll see that in a little bit. Anyways, white castled, and I played knight takes c3 now. And the reason I played knight takes c3 now is because I panicked. I was very wary of situations where, again, my knight would be attacked again with some move like, I don't know if I was afraid of bishop d3. There are even certain scenarios where I was worried about knight h4 being a potential move. Obviously here it doesn't work because the queen guards the h4 square. But there were certain scenarios where I just felt like my pieces were fairly, insecure. So I thought this would be, a decent time to resolve the tension, but it just strengthens white's center. And after knight takes e3, b takes e3, you can see that the difference in, minor pieces here is pretty extraordinary. In particular, my knight on c6 and my bishop on b6, really bad pieces. I went knight e7 trying to fix that, trying to relocate my knight to a better square, but it kind of exacerbates the problem because now white went for the very, very strong knight h4. And this is just a massively strong move because in addition to threatening to win the bishop pair, now white is also trying to get the pawns rolling. And if white manages to get f4 and f5 in, you could see that this pawn chain connected with this push would be decisive. I don't have enough pawns on the side of the board, or pieces for that matter, to contest this f4, f5 push. So anyways, I went c6 just to sort of attack the bishop. I kind of resigned myself to the fact that I would lose my own light squared bishop, because if I retreat, let's say like bishop g6, white doesn't need to take the bishop on g6 right away, but can go f4, and you can already see this f5 move is devastating. So anyways, after knight h4, c6, knight takes f5, happily played, knight takes f5, and bishop d3. And my idea here with actually going for this knight e7 maneuver was that I thought, well, at least white has the two bishops for the moment, but I'm getting rid of one of them. So I played knight takes e3, and after f takes e3, I recognized that my bishop on b6 was terrible. I mean, it's very hard to challenge the pawn on d4, especially now that the e3 pawn and the c3 pawn are reinforcing the d4 pawn for sure. But I thought that the presence of the opposite-colored bishops would give me good chances to hold the game, or to get some counterplay, really. But it turns out that that's not the case. I started with queen g5, which I thought was pretty logical, attacking the e3 pawn and stopping white from going queen h5, which would, be all up in my craw, threaten checkmate, and all that good stuff. So I thought queen g5 was a good move. And then white played queen e2, and it was here that I kind of realized that, this position was trickier than I thought, because even though there's opposite-colored bishops, white has the open file for his rook, which creates really great attacking chances. And with that open file, it's easy for him to double, whereas my rooks are really purely defensive, and it's hard to imagine the rook on a8, in particular, getting into the game in an efficient manner. So I already have some problems here to solve. And the presence of opposite-colored bishops really always help the attacking side. So it's something where I have to be wary of just, being attacked with a bishop that's just not playing. So it's almost like I'm down a piece in those type of scenarios. So I went g6, trying to blunt this bishop on d3, blunt its diagonal, make sure it doesn't have as much influence. And white went rook f4, which is actually a mistake. It's not a mistake I capitalized on, but it is a mistake. Instead, better would have been rook f6, just dominating on the square that I've weakened, this f6 square, and trying to double. And the point is now if I challenge that rook with bishop d8, now white would go rook f3, and the little finesse there is that now this bishop on d8 is a little misplaced. I mean, it did challenge the rook on f6, but it also got in the way of my rooks being connected, and this bishop on d8 is a little bit off. So you kind of gain a half tempo with this maneuver. So rook f6 was a little bit stronger. The issue with rook f4 is actually I have a nuance that I calculated but could not make work. In this position I was trying, I thought for like 10 minutes, I was like, well, I would love to play f6. I would love to play f6. But I was seeing that after I play f6, if e takes f6, rook takes f6, I noticed that rook g4 would, or excuse me, not rook g4, I noticed that h4 would challenge my queen. So the thing that I was worried about was after f6, e takes f6, if I go rook takes f6, h4, I lose a piece because my queen can no longer protect the rook on f6. So I looked at this and I rejected this f6 move because of I couldn't recapture. But it turns out that in this position, I can actually go with the move bishop c7. And it's super, super critical because now I'm challenging the rook on this diagonal, and my bishop has a diagonal to work with finally, now that the pawn is no longer on e5. And wherever the rook moves, then I could recapture on f6. So the point is if rook at g4 comes now I can consider going queen h6, actually threatening mate. Or I can just play queen takes f6. And now black is completely equalized because, we have the opposite colored bishops here and my pieces are actually active and fighting. And then the other thing is if well, if you don't play in this position after bishop c7, if you don't move the rook, if you play a move like f7 check, this is still fine for black. These exchanges won't really change very much. And again, once I get my other rook to f8, I should be completely fine. So this was the opportunity that I missed to equalize. And, well, it was unfortunate because after I missed this, it meant I was in for some suffering. So I went c5. Once I thought that f6 didn't work, I tried to, lash out in the middle as quickly as possible because I recognized that now if I couldn't play f6, he was going to double and start to have serious threats on my king side. The problem with c5 is it doesn't really undermine the d4 pawn as much as I'd like because there's multiple methods of reinforcement here. And in the meantime, I've really weakened my d5 pawn. So now there's scenarios where if the bishop ever gets to attack the d5 pawn, my whole position collapses because the d5 pawn is the highway to my king side and to my queen side. So c5 was probably more trouble than it was worth, but I was already thinking I needed to, try to do something active, and it turned out that this was just not the right thing to do. White doubled, ignoring that threat. And now I went queen e7 back, recognizing just how serious my position was and that I need to probably reinforce f7. But the problem with this is that it allows queen f3. And now you can see, we're so early in the game and there's an Alekhine's gun on my f7 pawn. Very, very tragic. I believe this position is completely lost. d5 is loose. This rook on a8 isn't playing. I'm very defensive. And white has many, long-term ways to win the game as well, which I'll get into in a little bit. Anyways, I went rook a d8, trying to get my other rook in the game and also protecting d5. White went queen h3, which I think is a very reasonable move, eyeing h7. There are some ideas with rook h4 in the air, all types of nasty ideas. And I took on d4, and after e takes d4, I went king g7. And the idea with king g7 was just to cover the h6 square because I was worried about scenarios where, let's say I make a move like a6, just a dummy move. Now there's this idea queen h6 with rook h4 mate and mate to follow. So really, really tough scenarios I was dealing with. So I just guarded king g7 just to stop that one idea, but my problems aren't gone. White now went rook f6, trying to get the, just cement the rook on that square and really stop f6 once and for all. And it's a reasonable move, but I think there's some other attractive options. I think the easier way to win, frankly, for white, and I think is the cleanest way, is to actually go bishop c2. And the point is with bishop c2 is that you just relocate this bishop to b3, where not only is it hitting d5, you're also defending a2, and in some lines, if that d5 pawn goes away, you can see this bishop lined up against f7. So I think bishop c2 would have been the cleanest way to win, and just a really, really efficient job because I'm kind of lacking counterplay. Instead, rook f6 allows the game to continue, and I think it's a step in the wrong direction. I went rook c8, trying to get active now that my pawn on d5 wasn't hit. I thought my best chance of counterplay was on the open file, so I was eyeing c3 as a potential way to hit the d3 bishop. And then there was also the point that if, let's say white goes like for a ridiculous move like a4, I was looking at rook c3, and if the bishop moves somewhere, let's say e2, I have bishop takes d4 tactic because the pawn would be pinned to the queen. So I did have a sliver of hope once I saw this idea and that rook c8 actually threatened something because I've been kind of grasping at straws the last few moves. So after rook c8, white went queen g3, and yeah, I mean, it's a move, but it doesn't actually address my rook c3 idea, so I think it was another step in the wrong direction. I went rook c3 very quickly, no hesitation with this. You don't have to ask me twice. Now I think black has a lot of counterplay. Basically, the issue is that this bishop is now, just not in a great place, and I have this bishop takes d4 tactic. And I think actually before rook c3, one of the things that white actually perhaps overlooked when he tried to play queen h3 and rook f6 is, you love to make this e6 move, right? Because after e6, you think the position's going to open up. There's some devastating tactics. But the point is that I always have queen takes f6. And this is an important detail because after queen takes f6, rook takes, king takes, yes, it's true that my position is not amazing, but it's actually more than holdable, I believe, because I actually have a lot of counterplay with the two rooks. I mean, there's just a lot of life in this position, and even though white might be better, I don't think it's a position that white, will definitely win because I have two rooks for the queen, and that's typically enough. So I think that was a pretty important detail that he missed, is that he always wanted to play e6, but he missed that I have queen takes f6. And that's important because I think after queen g3 and rook c3, I think he might have been thinking that there was e6 in the air. Because e6 here, I would be in dire straits if I had to recapture on e6 because f8 is hanging. But it turns out again that I have this queen takes f6 move, and this changes everything. Because after queen e5 check, I can just go king e7, and again, I'm not going to pretend to try to say I'm better here or anything, but I'm not getting checkmated, and, the game goes on. So I think this was something that he just missed. Anyways, after rook c3, white went queen g5, and now the game really turned because queen g5, doesn't really solve the problem of this bishop on d3. Now, temporarily, I cannot take on d3 because of a tactic, right? If rook takes d3, there's rook takes g6 check, and I lose my queen and the game, right? That's fine. That's all fine and dandy because now after takes, now e6 is a threat, and it's just a big problems here. But instead of rook takes d3, I have a really, really nice move here that defends against rook takes g6 and consolidates my position in a way where I'm the one with threats. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what this move is. Black to move. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video. The move I played here for black was the incredible defensive move, bishop d8. And it's very, very unusual, but the point is that now the bishop is actually defending the queen, so there's no discovered checks on g6. And so at the moment, I'm actually protecting everything, and I still maintain the threat on the rook on d3. Or excuse me, the bishop on d3. The other thing that's huge about this move is now once my queen moves away, I actually am skewering the rook on f6 and the queen on g5. So all of a sudden I have multiple threats, and you can see that somehow, some way, white has not managed to crash home on my king side, amazingly. I thought I was going to get mated. I thought there was going to be h4, h5, h6 sightings. I thought I wouldn't get any counterplay on the c-file, but all of a sudden the game just turns. White went bishop b1, just trying to cover that bishop. And here there's actually it's still quite complicated because, you might say, well, what if you make a move like queen c7 and you take on f6? Well, in those cases, I'd actually get mated because let's say I play a move, let's say white just plays a move like king h1 and then I take. You notice that after g takes f6, the queen can come to h6 and nearly deliver mate. I mean, perhaps this scenario I can hold because there's king h8, queen h6, and rook g8. But there's certain scenarios where I have to really look out for mates, and it just seemed very, very dangerous to go for this type of position. So instead, after bishop b1, I was trying to find a different way to keep my queen, reasonably close to the action and still threaten the skewer. And the move I came up with, quite remarkably, is queen e6. And this one I was really proud of. The point is that after queen e6, I'm still threatening the skewer. And you might say, well, e takes f6 is still a problem, right, with check and then queen h6. But the point is that after I took the rook, my queen is also eyeing the e3 pawn, so I could challenge the queen from h6 if it ever winded up there. So just a really, really interesting move that defends f7, also holds g6 in some lines, and also eyes e3. Now you might say, okay, your queen is attacked. What about the endgame? Well, the point is that the endgame is actually good for me. If you play rook takes c6, I go bishop takes g5. In this position, the rook on e6 is attacked and the pawn on e3 is attacked. And so, you know, black would be better here. I mean, a line that could go rook d6, bishop takes e3, king h1, and okay, maybe rook. What you do here? Maybe something like rook c8, and maybe rook c1 is a serious threat. So, yeah, this is a very interesting position. And because of this, black is the one that would be for choice here. So this whole thing with bishop d8 and queen e6 just kind of really messed up white's whole position. And yeah, all of a sudden it turned from being winning to being worse. The other thing is that this bishop on b1 now, which we were talking about as a strength on d3, is now kind of a liability, because if it's not crashing down on g6, it's woefully misplaced. Instead, it would love to be on b3. So anyways, after queen e6, white really panicked, and I think it was also a product of some time trouble. I believe white was in some time trouble at this point, and went for the move rook 1 f3. But unfortunately, this move does not get the job done. I think his idea was to go in some lines rook h3. So there's some real dangers here. For instance, if I take on f6, after e takes f6, check, and king h8, and queen h6, there are some mating ideas at times. I'm not sure if this is exactly one of those times, but one idea is that if the queen ever leaves this square, there's queen h7 and rook h3 mate. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that we have something like this happen. Now there's queen takes h7, king takes, and mate. And that's something you definitely would not want to fall for. So I think he was just trying to shift the rook over to defend e3, but also facilitate rook h3 at times. But now that he was leaving his rook from the first rank, I took the opportunity to give this check. I mean, why not? I mean, now I get to draw the king out. It looks that I'm challenging the bishop on b1. I thought this was a fantastic move. So after rook c1, white went king f2, and I was like, wow, is he really giving up a piece here? What's the idea? And the more I looked at it, I was like, oh, did I miss something? Is there some type of mate? And I calculated, and I've kind of finally realized that there actually isn't a mate, and I could, just take the bishop. So I did. I went rook takes b1. And now white went for it with rook h3, trying to get this forced mate action with queen h6 and queen h7 mate. And it looks really, really dangerous. It looks really precarious. But it turns out here that there are, a few very nice finesses, and I managed to find, I think, one of the more remarkable ones. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out what I played. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure it out. The first thing I was thinking about, I didn't play this, was actually queen takes h3. And the idea is that after actually queen takes h3, g takes h3, I don't take on f6 right away because I don't want that thorn pawn, but instead I go rook b6. And the point is that the white rook on f6 is pinned, and I managed to recover it and, get a reasonable position with the two rooks for the queen, and it's probably winning, but I thought there might be some drawing chances for white. For instance, if like king e2, bishop takes f6, e takes f6, rook takes f6, I thought after a move like queen takes d5, maybe he would have some chances to recoup some pawns and deliver some checks and just frustrate me. So I didn't want to go for this line because I thought he would have decent drawing chances. And then I realized, well, that is my safety line. That's if nothing else works, I'll go for that one. But it turned out in this position after rook h3 that there were other options, and I started to pan over those other options, and I found this one that I really was attracted to, which was what I played, queen f5 check. And it's a really funny move. I mean, it's kind of a unique, paradoxical situation where my queen can now be captured two ways, but neither are particularly effective, and he has to capture it because I'm up a piece now, and if he trades queens, I just have a winning endgame. So he pretty much is obliged to play rook takes f5. And now I'm actually giving the piece back, because after bishop takes g5, rook takes g5, the material is actually equal here. But the problem is these rooks that were, these attacking pieces on the H and G files are all of a sudden horrible, horrible pieces because there's no attack here. And now they're kind of hemmed in by their own pawns. So I evaluated this position, even though it was even material, to be completely winning for black. And yeah, I went for this. Now I went rook b2 check. The king has to move. If you go back to the first rank with like king g1, now I go rook c8, and all of a sudden I even have mating. Mate seems like it's coming, so that would be unfortunate. So he has to step up with king f3. And again, look at how terrible these rooks are now that the queens are off the board. It would seem that black is completely winning with all the activity in the world and about to win this a pawn. It just felt like it was over. I went rook takes a2, and now I'm actually a pawn up. And again, these rooks, how are they going to get into the game? White kind of, desperately needed to try something to stay active. And so he went for e4 because it's the only way to try to get these rooks going. If you don't do anything, if you play, I don't even know what you could play, honestly. But let's say you play rook g4, I can, either push my pawn with b5. I can get this other rook around with rook c8. There's so many plans, and these pawns in the center aren't really rolling right now. So e4 was his try. And now I played f6, which I thought was a pretty important move because I really did not want this king on e4 to get towards the center. And I thought if I take like this, now the king kind of, gets in here and there starts to be some counterplay, and now the rook is active. So I didn't want to allow that so easily. So the point is, after f6, that if I challenge this rook and if he takes on f6, I take back and have a check on a3, and I push his king backward. White played e takes f6, and I played rook takes f6. And after king e3, I went rook a3 check. So I wound up getting what I wanted. And now the king has to back up to e2, and I get another favorable exchange because after rook takes h3, g takes h3, he has these really, really ugly double pawns, and I have two connected pass pawns on the queen side. And now, after d takes e4, I'm actually 2 pawns up, which is just incredible transformation from the position that I had 15 moves ago that was just completely losing. So, really, really amazing turnaround, and not something that happens every day. White played king e3 now, trying to recover one of those pawns. But I still felt pretty good because even if white gets one of these pawns back, I still have connected passers on the queen side, and I have a better pawn structure on the king side. So I figured that if I was able to control the d pawn, I'd be in good shape, even if I lost the e pawn. So in rook endgames, it's all about activity. So the first thing I want to do is try and activate my rook and really activate my king as well and limit some of his activity. So I started with the move rook f5. And the idea with rook f5 is that you cut the rook off from the 5th rank. Obviously, trades are not in the cards for white, so white has to move back, and he did with rook g1. And now I should try and get my king active, and I made a huge mistake here. I should try to play a move like rook b5, protecting my pawns and preparing to get my... Oh, excuse me, I played rook b5. That's a mistake. Instead, I should have played king f6. I've moved my king in. I get my king active. I start to get opposition. So if king takes e4, king e6, now my king is controlling the white king from crossing the plane. But instead, I thought it was safer to get my rook over to protect my pawns because I was wary of rook b1 happening, challenging my pawns. But rook b5 is a serious mistake. And the reason it's a serious mistake is because of white's move, which is really smart and really alert, which is rook f1. And the point is you don't take on e4 because, you're going to take their next move. But first, you restrict the activity of my king, because if you're able to cut off my king on the f-file and start to push your d-pawn, I'm going to have a problem. So I basically lost a tempo by playing rook b5 because now as long as my king is cut off, which I have to go back. So I wound up going now rook f5 so that my king could cross the plane again. And now white went rook b1 and actually gained a tempo when you could see that if I started with king f6 here, my king would already have been involved in the game. And a move like rook b1 wouldn't have concerned me because I could just play b6. So very, very important detail that I missed. Well, I realized it as soon as I made the move, but I missed it, when it mattered. So tough break, and I was really frustrated, and I was shaking my head because it's just, you're winning, and to let someone off the hook like that and give them a chance when they shouldn't have any chance is unfortunate. But I still had a better pawn structure, still an extra material, so still not totally spoiled, but it just made the conversion harder. So anyways, rook f1, rook f5 back, rook b1, and now b6 protecting that pawn. And now king takes e4. And again, my king needs to get active, so I go king f6 to facilitate that activity, try to get to e6, get the opposition so this king can't get active. And now white went rook c1. Reasonable move, trying to get active, trying to get counterplay on my pawns. I have to be very, very precise here to fend off white's counterplay, and I think some of my next few moves are really, really instructive, so pay attention here. I first start with king e6. And the reason I play king e6 is to get that opposition. Very, very important. Now black went for rook c7. And that attacks both pawns on f7 and a7. But I was not fazed by this because now I have the move rook h5. And this is a key move. Because the idea is, I do have connected passed pawns, and it would seem that you'd want to keep both of them, but it's more important to keep this king on e4 fended away from the middle. And the point is that if I decide to try and protect these pawns, like, let's say rook f7, rook c6 check, and king e7, now this white king is getting very active, and after a move like, king e5 or maybe pawn d5, things are becoming a little bit shaky because white is getting active all of a sudden and I'm being pushed back. And the material does not matter as much as the activity does. So I need to keep this king pushed away. And after rook h5, the point is that if you play rook takes a7, I go rook h4 check and push the white king back with opposition. So anyways, after rook h5, rook takes a7, rook h4 check did happen. And after king d3, another very, very key important move happened, which was the move king d5. Critical move. And the point is that this h3 pawn isn't going anywhere, and neither this h2 pawn. It's more important for me to keep the opposition on white's king and push it back so that the d pawn can't be easily chaperoned to the other side of the board, to the 8th rank, right? So I really was trying to keep the king away. And this forces white's reply, rook d7 check, because he needs to get his king in the game. And so you can see that even though the material is now equal temporarily, I've managed to get my king active and my rook active, which is huge. So after rook d7, I went king c6, attacking this rook. And now rook e7 was played. And now I went rook takes h3. And this is a huge difference because now I'm taking this pawn with check. And I managed to push the king back a little bit before I did. And my king on c6 is way more active than it would have been if it was back on e7 or f6 like it was before. So I've made some real gains while I traded some material. So after rook takes h3, king e4 is played. And now I went king d6, another critical move. The point is that if I go rook takes h2, this might be a decent move, but the point is I allowed d5 check. And after king d6 and rook e6, again, he's getting a little bit more active than I would like. So even though this position may be technically won, I don't like that my king is getting pushed back and his king might come up the board. So I thought it was really, really important, again, to box that king out. And note that with king d6, I'm boxing the king out because it cannot cross the plane right now. So after king d6, white went rook b7 to attack that pawn. And now I went rook h4 check, again, boxing this king out. It cannot cross the plane. It has to go backwards. So king d3 was played. And now I went king c6, and defending this pawn, you could see it's almost like triangulation, where you get the opposition by shuffling the king around, and then the king runs out of moves. But I'm almost triangulating with my king and my rook at the same time before I just rush to take h2. And the point is, h2 isn't going anywhere, so I just need to limit white's activity. I sound like a broken record, but it's true. The flip side is that if I have two connected passed pawns and I manage to make sure this pawn doesn't get advanced very far, the d pawn, I'll be winning. So that's the other thing, is that I'm not trying to rush with my own plans. After king c6, white now rook f7, and now I went b5. Again, not being greedy, very, very important. And the point is with b5 that if rook f6 check comes, I can now step up to d5 and there are no checks, which is huge. So white played rook f8 instead, but you can see that now that there are no checks right now, I've managed to still control white. And the other thing that's important to point out is that if I did take the pawn right away, after rook f6 check, I wouldn't want to necessarily step up because maybe he could take on b6. Although now that I'm noticing after king d5, rook takes b6, I have opposition again and can secure the d4 pawn. So maybe it didn't quite matter, but I thought the finesse was cute and kind of nuanced, but maybe it wasn't a big deal. So anyways, after b5, I've also managed to cut the king off from coming around to c4, which I also liked. So just really controlling everything before going forward. White went rook f8. I now finally took the pawn with rook takes h2. And all of a sudden, the position, now I'm 2 pawns up again, but I have all this activity, which is awesome. White now went rook c8. I went king d7, rook b8, and now rook h5, protecting the pawn horizontally. And the thing I liked about this is I'm also cutting the king off from the 5th rank and also preventing the pawn from being pushed. So I really liked that I was defending and my pawn on the b file and also stopping him from advancing. White now went rook b6, I guess trying to cut my king off a little bit, but it doesn't have enough squares on the b file, so I just played king c7 challenging. And after rook a6, I went rook h3 check. And now I thought that my b pawn was sufficiently far enough where I could release the white king to come in because I could start to push my b pawn. And I kind of calculated this out. So after king e4, now I played b4. And the point is that now that my pawn comes to b3, it'll be a very, very significant distraction for white's rook. And it's hard to imagine white being able to push the d pawn while also worrying about the b pawn and my connected pass pawns. So I figured that now I'd done more than enough to get back on the winning track and sort of stifle any of white's activity. White did continue a little bit, though. He went d5, trying to push that pawn. And now I went b3. And yeah, it's a huge problem for white now that this pawn is basically gonna queen. White went rook c6 check. I went king b7. I like going to b7 because I control the white rook from getting behind the pawn. And the other funny finesse here is that if white goes rook c5 to try and get to the b file, I have rook h4 check, king d3, and rook b4. And the issue is now that my rook is behind the pawn, he can't go rook b5. And if he goes king c3 to attack my rook and maybe get his king behind the pawn, I actually have b2, which, queens. So he can't both take the rook and prevent b1 queen, so that would be the game. So actually he can't get his rook behind the pawn anymore, which is a huge problem. So after king b7, rook c5 did happen, rook h4, and now king e5 happened. And here I went rook b4, and after d6, I went b2, and I was about to queen, and it was here that Jorden resigned, because if you go d7, I can just queen, and after d8 queen, well, it's black to move, and I have more than enough artillery to checkmate him. I could start with a move like queen f5, and after king d6, rook d4 check, and this game will end very quickly. I can even take everything with check if I don't see any mate, so that would be the game. So I'm queening first, he can't stop it, and yeah, it's a W. A very, very sharp game, one that I was very, very fortunate to win given the opening that I got myself into. But I was really, really happy and elated with the way that I fought back from a position of weakness, right? I was not playing it from a position of strength, and I managed to just kind of hang in there, deal with the blows, and not give up. There was a moment when he had doubled his rooks and had his queen on the king side where I thought I maybe was going to have to resign, but resigning hasn't gotten anyone anywhere. So, I mean, of course, if you don't have any material and, you're down a lot of material, maybe it makes sense to resign. But in a position with even material, at least let them have to prove it a little bit. And that's what I did. And unfortunately for him, today he was not, on that day, he was not up to the task. So I was really, really happy with it. And I thought that my endgame technique was good after I missed the rook f5 move. I mean, or the king f6 move, because at the end of the day, I was a pawn up and I managed to box his king out efficiently to finish the game, which was huge. So anyways, this took me, to a really, really good spot with 2 rounds to go, and I was able to start thinking about GM norm. So stay tuned for what happens next. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.